I've presented this about 2 years ago, but since we have a lot of new members in our team and since work in the Pacific will start soon, it may be a useful topic for most of us. Let's move on to housing. Housing is an important part of the economy and the national accounts. It is part of personal consumption expenditures within the GDP. The aggregate expenditure on housing measures what is spent by household on housing services. Goods and services part of housing include actual and imputed rentals for housing, maintenance and repair of the dwelling, major household appliances, whether electric or not, and small tools and miscellaneous accessories. Spending on housing services as percent of consumption varies from country to country. In some countries, housing expenditure account for more than 10% of total consumption. Generally, a large portion of spending on housing goes to actual and imputed rent. At least 90% of total housing consumption in Afghanistan, Bhutan, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, among others, is actual and imputed rent. Okay, this chart here shows the 10-year status in the EU countries in 2018. It shows that in most EU countries, except for Switzerland, more than 50% are owner-occupied, as can be seen in the orange and yellow parts of the chart. This table shows home ownership rate in some countries. Home ownership rate, by definition, refers to the ratio of owner-occupied units to total residential units in a specified area. So countries like Romania, Singapore, Slovakia, Croatia, China, and Cuba have home ownership rates of at least 90%. In the Philippines, about 44% of the households have owner-like possession of house and lot. This leads to the discussion on the estimation of final expenditure on housing, given there are rented dwellings and owner-occupied dwellings. Dwelling services are produced from the stock of housing for consumption. So for rental housing, it is pretty straightforward. The market rents are a good approximation of the value of the dwelling services. The market rents include the sum of rents paid by household that rent their accommodation, including those dwellings that are rented but not occupied and rented as secondary residences. Rent in this case is defined as the payments for the use of the land on which the property stands, the dwelling occupied, the fixtures and fittings for heating, plumbing, and lighting, the furnitures in the case of a dwelling let furnished, and the garage or parking space. But for owner-occupied dwellings, they do not pay a price for the accommodation that is consumed, so the estimation is not as straightforward as rented dwelling. As illustrated earlier, since large portion of dwellings are owner-occupied, estimating housing services produced and consumed by household is crucial. In the national accounts, owner-occupiers are deemed to be unincorporated businesses producing housing services which they then consume. Because of this, there is a need to impute a rental value for an owner-occupied property, which is the same as the rental that would be paid for a similar property in the private rented sector. Imputed rent is then the rent of owner-occupiers and rent-free dwellings. By rent-free dwellings, we mean those who live in houses owned by their families or friends and do not pay for their use of that property. This also includes those which pay rent that are below the market price. Imputed rent can then be thought of as the value that owner-occupiers effectively pay themselves to rent their own houses. And since no such payment occurs in reality, the payment must be imputed or modeled. So why is there a need to impute rent? So based on literature, the simple answer is for consistency. Approximating the value of services provided by owner-occupied housing is the largest imputation in the GDP accounts according to the U.S. Bureau for Economic Analysis. The measurement of imputed rent is required by the International System of National Accounts as part of GDP to ensure that the valuation of housing services is calculated on a consistent basis over time, allowing for comparisons across countries with very different institutional frameworks for housing. It also ensures that GDP is not systematically higher in countries with higher prevalence of rented dwellings compared to those with higher prevalence of owner-occupied dwellings, as as it requires the treatment of owner-occupied dwellings in the GDP comparable to the tenant-occupied housing, which is valued by rent paid. So imputed rent keeps GDP invariant as to whether a house is owner-occupied or rented. How is imputed rent measured? There are three main methods. The first one is rental equivalence or stratification method. The second is user cost approach, and the third is self-assessment. We will discuss in detail the first two, rental equivalence and user cost approach, but just to give an idea, we have the third method, self-assessment, but this is usually considered a weak measure of imputed rent. It requires the owner-occupiers to provide estimates of their property rentals, and this is usually connected with the HES or the census, but this usually yields overestimated rental values, hence it is not usually used. However, in the HIES interviews, usually they ask about specific costs. So if the interviews were conducted properly, this could be tied to the user cost approach. Okay, moving to the rental equivalence or stratification method. The guiding principle in the 1993 System of National Accounts is housing services produced are deemed to be equal in value to the rentals that would be paid on the market for accommodation of the same size, quality, and type. According to one of the surveys conducted, the rental equivalence method is used by most countries. In this approach, which is the recommended methodology by the SNA 93 and ESA 95, rents for owner-occupied dwellings would be the same as rents paid on similar dwellings. This is viewed as the marginal opportunity cost of renter for owner-occupiers, meaning it is an opportunity cost for a homeowner who can potentially rent out a house or move to rental housing. To compute for imputed rent, the number of owner-occupied dwelling in the strata or in that stratum is multiplied by the average rent paid for rented accommodation in the stratum. So the sum of the imputed rent across strata gives the total imputed rent for the country. Apart from the stratification methodology, which is the usual method used, some countries employ the hedonic regressions to estimate information which are missing, like in the case of France, Germany, Japan, and Latvia, while others use the Heckman regression method, which is the case in the countries like Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Italy. Other less common methods are linear regression methods, the combination of different approaches, and a subjective method. Okay, what are the problems that arise when the country does not have a well-developed and broadly based rental sector? So the first issue is it cannot be used. The rental equivalence method cannot be used if there are only a few dwellings rented, since rent actually paid cannot be regarded as typical. The second issue is if the dwelling structures are occupied by foreigners who pay higher rent or employees of government and large enterprises which have subsidized rent, then the imputed rent may be overestimated or underestimated. The third issue is if rents cannot be regarded as representative, for example, in the case when dwellings are only available in the capital or the urban areas, which tells us that rental dwellings are not evenly distributed across the country. If these are the case, then a user cost approach is not recommended. Okay. Oh, sorry, let me backtrack. If those are the case, then the user cost approach is the recommended strategy instead of the rental equivalence method. Okay, so moving on to the user cost approach. The user cost approach is the international recommended alternative to the stratification approach. So it basically estimates each of the costs that owners would need to take into account in fixing a market rent if they decide to rent their dwellings to other people. At the minimum, only the breakdown of stock of owner-occupied dwellings is required. It is desired to distinguish at least single-family dwellings from apartments below a certain floor space and apartments above a certain floor space. Rent will then be imputed for each type of owner-occupied dwellings. Okay, so just to summarize, in choosing which estimation method to use, we can refer to this problem tree. As shown, we opt to choose to estimate using user cost method if first, there are no more than 25% of dwellings rented. Second, if more than 50% of rented dwellings are occupied by foreigners paying higher rent or employees paying subsidized rents. And third, if the rented dwellings are not evenly distributed throughout the country. Otherwise, we can estimate using the SNA recommended rental equivalence method. How do we impute rent using the user cost approach? A number of costs need to be taken into consideration, which include intermediate consumption, other taxes on production, consumption of fixed capital, and net operating surplus. Before we go into the details of each, let us discuss first the estimation of stock of ownership of dwelling, which is important in computing consumption of fixed capital and net operating surplus later on. Okay, the estimation of stock of ownership of dwellings is one of the main difficulties in applying the user cost approach. There are two estimations of stocks that are needed. The first one is the one without land, since no consumption of fixed capital is calculated in respect to land. And second, the value of land together with the dwelling, which is used in the computation of net operating surplus because owner's total investment covers both land and the structure itself. Okay. Moving to the first one, the standard procedure for estimating stock of capital asset is the perpetual inventory method, or the PIM. This is recommended by ESA 95 in the calculation of stock of fixed assets whenever direct information is missing. It allows an estimate to be made of the stock of fixed assets in existence and in the hands of the producers, which is generally based on estimating how many of the fixed assets installed as a result of gross fixed capital formation undertaken in the previous years have survived to the current period. The PIM requires first long time series on GFCF, second prices of capital assets, the third one is assumptions about the average service lives of assets, and lastly the depreciation method and distribution of retirement around the average service life. Okay, the most common way of calculating the stock is to assume a straight line depreciation, which means that the fall in value is spread out evenly over an asset's service life or useful life. It also assumes a bell-shaped mortality function. Mortality function, by definition, indicates what proportion of a vintage of capital assets are retired in a given period. It is important because if we have a capital with an asset of, say, 15 years, without any additional information, we would assume that all assets are retired after exactly 15 years, which is not usually the case. Some would retire after 10 years, or others will retire after 20 years. So the 15 years is just the average. So having an assumption about the mortality function is crucial. Bell-shaped mortality function describes just that, which is the pattern of retirements. It can be either symmetrical or skewed to the left or right, depending on the value assigned to the particular parameters. If a long time series of GFCF is not available, this can be approximated by geometric depreciation with no mortality function. Depreciation rate is then declining balance rate over the average service life of the asset. Declining balance would mean you will depreciate the assets more during the earlier years and less in later years. A practical implication of this method is that the value of depreciation is directly calculated by multiplying the depreciation rate to the stock of owner-occupied dwellings and does not have to be estimated separately for every vintage of dwelling. Several countries participating in the ICP 2004 have derived capital stock estimates by the PIM, but most participating countries do not have such estimates, so it is necessary to consider an alternative method, and in this case, the geometric depreciation with no mortality function is the only feasible method. Let us discuss the second option, or the method which is designed for countries that do not have time series data on GFCF and only have information from their population census on the number of owner-occupied dwelling classified by a few broad types of dwellings. So we need to draw up a classification of dwellings which distinguishes between main types of dwellings. The stock of owner-occupied dwellings will then be estimated separately for each type. compute for the value of stock of OOD, we would need to compute or estimate the mid-year number of owner-occupied dwellings. To get this, we would need to get the number of owner-occupied dwelling units at the time of the most recent census. At the minimum, they collect the number of OODs and some indication of the physical characteristics of these structures. This can also be sourced from the living standard surveys, which usually include detailed statistics on the type of structure and facilities contained in the dwellings. This value will then be multiplied by the growth rate of owner-occupied dwellings between the last census and the middle of the current year. This growth rate can be derived from GFCF statistics, building permits issued, and some administrative data on completion and destruction of buildings. If this is not available, we can assume that the stock of owner-occupied dwellings grows at the same rate as the population. Now that we have the estimated mid-year number of owner-occupied dwellings, to compute for the value of stock of OOD, we multiply this value by the average net value of a dwelling excluding land in the current year. Now, how do we compute the average net value of a dwelling? We can refer to these formulas here. So average net value of dwelling is the value of the dwelling net accumulated depreciation. So to compute for the average net value of dwelling excluding land, which is P average in the equation, we will be needing information on the average price of newly constructed dwellings, also excluding land in the current year, which is P new in the equation. Prices can be obtained from a number of sources, although these prices might need to be adjusted downwards by subtracting the value of the land, since the prices must refer to only the physical structure. And since this price is the price of newly constructed dwelling, for which the data is available, we would need to adjust this downward to approximate the price of a dwelling of average age. Okay, the simplest way to do it is to assume that the prices of dwelling decline by the same amount each year and reaches the price of zero in the last year of its life. To do that, we multiply the price of newly constructed dwelling, P new, by the ratio of the remaining years of the dwelling of average land, L minus A, by the expected service life of L, which is this equation here. Okay, it is important to note that the stock of dwelling is not constant, meaning the number of new dwellings constructed each year is not the same number of old dwellings demolished each year. This means that the average age of dwellings is also not that straightforward, and that it depends on whether stock grows or falls during that year. Average age of dwelling is then dependent on the average growth in stock of dwellings, which in this formula is provided by R. When R is zero, it means that the stock of dwelling is stable, but if the stock is growing, the average age will be less than the midpoint because the number of younger dwellings will exceed number of older dwellings. And also when the percent of new dwellings is growing, then it follows that the average price will also rise. The reverse also applies. Okay, so we now have both estimated number of owner-occupied dwellings as well as the average net value of a dwelling. So multiplying both gives us the value stock of owner-occupied dwellings excluding land. Okay, now that we have the value stock of dwelling without land, what remains to be estimated is the value of stock of dwelling including land, which will be used in the computation of net operating surplus later on. The formula is pretty straightforward. We get the value of stock of owner-occupied dwellings, including land, by multiplying the value stock of OOD without land we previously computed by 1 plus the ratio of the value of land to the average net value of dwelling excluding land. This ratio can be obtained from a number of sources, like from realtors or official records of land values, or if this is not available, we can borrow ratio values from neighboring countries with similar population densities and housing structures. Okay, so moving on, now that we have estimated the value of stocks excluding and including land, we can move on to the computation of imputed rent using the user cost approach. As mentioned earlier, imputed rent is the sum of intermediate consumption, other taxes on production, consumption of fixed capital, and net operating surplus. For intermediate consumption of owner-occupied dwellings, we have three components. The first one is maintenance and repair of owner-occupied dwellings, or the expenditure of owner-occupiers on materials and services for minor repairs. The second one is net insurance premiums paid by owner-occupiers, which is just gross insurance premiums paid on OODs, less insurance claims paid to owners. And the third one is FISM on mortgage loans. When a house is financed by a mortgage, in principle, FISM charges relating to interest payments on the loan should be treated as part of intermediate consumption of the production activity associated with renting the property. So FISM in this case should be applied in relation to the proportion of mortgage loans to households over the total loans. Okay, looking further at maintenance and repair, what activities are considered part of intermediate consumption? Maintenance and repair refer to those activities undertaken regularly to ensure that the dwelling is in good condition. Intermediate consumption should cover the same type of ordinary maintenance and repairs as would normally be regarded as intermediate consumption by the landlord or a similar rented dwelling. This include materials and may also include payment to specialists in the building trade, like for example, plumbers or painters, and also the cost of these specialists, which include their compensation of employees. The next item, the maintenance and repair should not change the dwelling's performance, capacity, or expected service life. Otherwise, it is already considered GFCF. Finally, repairs undertaken by tenants rather than landlords should be treated as household final consumption for both tenants and owner-occupiers. Okay, let's look at three categories related to repairs and maintenance. The first one, expenditures on ordinary maintenance and repairs that an owner-occupier incurs on decoration, as well as maintenance and repair of the dwelling not typically carried out by tenants, are considered intermediate consumption. Improvements to existing fixed assets that go beyond the requirements of ordinary maintenance and repairs is already considered GFCF, and materials for small repairs to and interior decoration of dwellings of a kind typically carried out by tenants as well as owners are considered final consumption of expenditure. To know whether we should include an item as an expenditure of owner-occupier on materials and services for minor repair, we can refer to this simple problem 3. So we should include household expenditure on construction materials and services if, first, the payment represents activities regularly taken in order to maintain the dwelling in good working condition, and second, payments do not change dwelling's underlying standard of accommodation, capacity, or expected service life. If not all households live in their own home, we just get the proportion of households that do to estimate the expenditure of owner-occupiers on maintenance and repair. This is the same principle that should be done in other items when applying proportions to ensure consistency. Okay, moving on to the next component of imputed rent, we have other taxes on production. So this includes taxes paid by owners on the imputed value of the dwelling service they derive from owning the dwelling they occupy. Any subsidies that owner-occupiers receive to aid them in paying household expenses, like say for example, subsidization of mortgage rents or mortgage rates, are included as negative taxes. Another tax to be considered are property taxes, which are those taxes paid by owners on the value of owner-occupied dwellings and associated land. Okay, the third component is consumption on fixed capital. And as we mentioned earlier, we will use the stock of ownership of dwelling without land we computed earlier. So the CFC, or consumption of fixed capital on the stock of owner-occupied dwelling, is measured at current prices and is obtained from estimates of the stock of owner-occupied dwellings also valued at current prices. So countries that estimate stocks of dwellings using the PIM already have these estimates of consumption of fixed capital, but most countries do not have long time series of GFCF and the prices of capital assets. So we compute the consumption of fixed capital by multiplying the mid-year value of the net dwelling of stock by the depreciation rate. The depreciation rate for geometric depreciation is declining balance rate over the average service life of the asset. Declining balance rate is usually between 1 to 3. In Europe and North America, the value of the declining balance rate is 1.6, and this produces estimates of consumption of fixed capitals that are similar to those that are obtained by a bell-shaped mortality function. So it may be different from country to country, but if no information is available for our country, it is recommended to use a declining balance of 1.6. Okay, and finally, we have net operating surplus, where we will use the estimated stock of dwellings, including land. People acquire capital assets because the net operating surplus that they expect to earn is at least as high as the interest that they would earn by investing in a capital asset. So this applies to any capital asset whether it be factory building, machine, truck, or in this case, a dwelling. Net operating surplus is computed by multiplying the rate of return by the mid-year net value of dwelling stock, now including land in the current year. It is the rate of return that the owner-occupier would expect to get if he had invested in a financial asset rather than a dwelling. The real rate of return is used to correct for holding gains to the landlord. So selecting the rate of return is one of the difficulties in applying the user cost approach. Usually, the nominal interest rates and inflation rates are volatile from year to year. So if real interest rates were to be computed using these values, the real interest will also be volatile, and so is the estimated rent. But rents tend to be stable from year to year based on long-term contracts with the landlord. So a real interest rate calculated as a long-term average of nominal interest rates minus long-term inflation rates are preferred. So in practice, there are a number of options that we could use. So in countries where there is a well-established and widely used system of housing loans, the rate charged on these loans is the best one to use. If such system is not available, then the rate on long-term corporate or government bond, which is usually 8 years or more, can be used. This rate, however, should be applicable on newly issued debts. And finally, if the financial markets are less developed, a standard annual rate of return of 2.5 should be used, which means that the net operating surplus will be calculated as 0.025 times the current market value of the stock of owner-occupied dwellings. Okay, now that we have all four components, we can compute imputed rent as the sum of all four. And in the SUT, we record the transactions as follows. So materials and supplies for minor repairs are recorded here in number 1 under goods IC of the OOD sector or real estate depending on the structure of the SUT. Construction services for minor repairs and maintenance, item 2, are recorded under IC of services of the OOD sector. Item number 3, FISM on mortgage and insurance services on dwellings are recorded under IC of services of the OOD sector. Other taxes on production, consumption of fixed capital, and net operating surplus, items 4, 5, and 6, are recorded under the GVA items of the OOD sector. Total expenditure on OOD, item 7, is recorded as illustrated under GO, household consumption and supply of the OOD sector. Okay, now approaching the end of the presentation, let us just go through some questions. So over the past years, I've encountered usual questions on imputed rent. Listed here are a few of these questions. So the first one is, should we impute rent for household that do not own the structure but do not pay rent as well? So say those living in residences of relatives. So according to the Eurostat, imputed rent shall be imputed for all households that do not report paying full rent. So imputed rent is then formed also when people live in a dwelling owned by another household without payment, and when a rent lower than the market rent is paid for the dwelling. Different countries, however, have different treatment on this, but most countries compute imputed rent for both owner-occupiers and tenants paying below market or rent-free rents. Only a few countries consider owner-occupiers only, while it is unusual for countries to consider owner-occupiers and tenants paying rent-free rents, but excludes those paying below the market rent. So of the countries surveyed, only Slovakia does this. Only them estimate for owner-occupiers and tenants paying rent-free rents, but excludes those paying below the market rent. Okay. The second asked question is, do we include vacation houses in imputing rent? According to the Eurostat, it should be estimated only for dwellings used as a main residence by the household. While according to the SNA, the rental value of OODs abroad, like holiday homes, should not be recorded as part of domestic production, but as imports of services. Most countries surveys most countries that were surveyed impute rent on main residence only, while only a few estimates domestic second home, for example, Denmark, while only also a few estimates second home abroad, like in the case of Netherlands. Okay, another issue is the recording of Airbnb transactions or the sharing economy. The sharing economy also includes other platforms such as Uber and Snapcar. As mentioned earlier, only main residences are usually considered. However, measuring the sharing economy is now being explored given its increasing share and popularity. Okay, but the main issue in most countries is that they do not directly collect information on the supply of these sectors. So in this case, they do not collect information on the supply of housing services by the Airbnb. This makes reliable estimations difficult. I've read a paper, however, that Netherlands has started attempting to measure the sharing economy, particularly Airbnb. So they have attempted to estimate transactions, namely, first, intermediate consumptions of Airbnb hosts, which include the use of goods and services purchased by the house owners for their rental activities, including fee to be paid to Airbnb. And second, they have started computing for final consumption by guests of the produced lodging services and fee paid to Airbnb. And third, export of lodging services if guests are non-residents. So in this case, the traditional role of producer and consumer fades and becomes mixed, and renting out of units mean corrections need to be made to avoid double counting. So, for example, payments made by households for heating, water, and the like, which are fully counted as final household consumption, should be corrected for the part that is in fact intermediate consumption when they rent out the unit to other people. Based on my readings also, no country has fully captured the recording of sharing economy yet, but it could be an area that needs to be worked on soon. The sharing economy is also one of the areas that is being studied by digital economy literature online. So I think that's about it for the discussion of imputed rent. It's just an overview, but we can talk about how to fully compute for imputed rent when we go to country examples later on. So if you have any questions, maybe you can raise them now before we move on to the next presentation. If there are no questions, just feel free to send me an email if you have any questions on imputed rent, and I'll try my best to respond based on available literature on the matter. Maybe we can move on to Michael's presentation on NPISH and FCE. Let me just unshare my screen. Michael?
Thank you very much, Danny. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all well and healthy. For my part, as Danny have mentioned, I will be discussing the final consumption expenditure of nonprofit institutions serving households, or NPISH-FCE. If you have worked with the MRIO database, NPISH-FCE is represented there as F2. Okay, so to begin our presentation, let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen now? If you can see my screen, can you give me a thumbs up? I can't see any thumbs up there.
Yes,
Let's
Michael,
proceed.
we can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Danny. For today's presentation, the goal really is to familiarize ourselves with the concept of NPISH FCE. And in order to get our accomplish that objective, this presentation is divided into three parts. The first part of this presentation, we will focus on the background. Specifically, we will try to differentiate other nonprofit institutions from nonprofit institutions serving households. We will try to characterize NPISHs in this part. And in the second part, we will go into the discussion of NPISH FCE, where we will try to shed light on how to measure NPISH FCE, the estimation procedure used, the data sources used, and how NPISH FCE is inputted in the supply and use table. We will end this presentation by doing some worksheet examples where we will try to compute NPISH FCE estimates for two institutional units, one for a political party and the other, the NPISH FCE of the American Red Cross. And we will try also to put our estimates in the supply and use table framework. And without further ado, let us now start our presentation by first defining what an institutional unit is. So according to the SNA, an institutional unit is an economic entity that is capable of doing three things. Number one, it can own assets. Number two, it must be able to incur liabilities. And finally, it must engage in economic activities and in transactions with other entities. And the SNA identifies two types of institutional units. One would be households, the other would be legal or social entities. Since we're talking about NPISH here, the relevant institutional unit for us would be legal or social entities. But for the sake of completion, let's try to discuss households. Basically, a household is a group of persons who satisfy the following conditions. Number one is that they share the same living conditions. They pool some or all their income or wealth. And finally, they consume certain types of goods and services collectively. Take note that there are no restrictions on the number of members in a household. So a household can be formed by a single member or several persons. Take note too that if a household consists of more than one member, each member is not treated as a separate institutional unit, even if everyone in the household is considered as an adult according to law. This is because many of the financial transactions undertaken by a household pertain to all members of the household and cannot be split or allocated to each individual. So, for example, when a household pays their electricity bill, it is not possible to allocate part of the bill to each individual in the household. Likewise, some or all of income received by individual members of the same household may be pooled for the benefit of all members. And it is because of these reasons that it is the collective unit and not the individual members that are treated as a household. Take note too that a household need not comprise blood relations. In general, we have two types of households: an individual household and an institutional household. Some examples of institutional households would be prisons, long-term care facilities. But since the topic that we are going to discuss in today's session would be NPISH FCE, we will not deal with HFCE or households in detail. But if you're really interested in learning more about households and HFCE, please feel free to email me. I have a presentation on this, and I can also refer you to more references. But going back to the topic on hand, Let's now proceed to legal or social entities. The other institutional unit is our legal or social entities. And a legal or social entity is basically a unit that is recognized by law or society independently of the persons or other entities that may own or control it. Basically, legal or social entities are responsible and accountable for their economic decisions. And the SNA also identifies three types of legal or social entities. Number one, we have corporations. The other would be government. And finally, we have non-profit institutions. Take note that there, in most economies, uh, they are comprised of thousands and often millions institutional units. Thus, it would not be practical for national accountants to compile national accounts for each institutional unit. That is why in the SNA, to address that issue, what they do is they group institutional units into institutional sectors based on their principal functions, behaviors, and objectives. So the SNA identifies five types of domestic institutional sectors. So we have households, financial corporations, non-financial corporations, the general government, and our topic of interest, non-profit institutions serving households. So basically, what happens is that from institutional units, we group them from institutional units, we group them by sector. So we have institutional sector. But let us try to first identify rubrics and metrics so that a unit, when will a unit be classified under the nonprofit institution serving households? Okay, and the unit of interest for us would be nonprofit institutions. So let's try to define nonprofit institution first. Basically, an NPI is created for the purpose of producing or distributing goods and services. NPIs are distinguished from other types of institutional units by their purpose because the main purpose of an NPI is to provide services of benefit to individuals or society rather than for profit. So operationally, the owners controlling the NPI cannot derive financial gains or surplus from its operations. So in practice, NPI's productive activities can generate either surpluses or deficits, but the surpluses cannot be shared by the institutional units that control or manage them. NPIs, as you will see later on, it may engage in market or non-market activities, and they may be created by households, corporations, or governments. And later on, you will see that depending on what they do and who controls them, they can be classified, NPIs can be classified into various institutional sectors. So it is not automatic that when the unit is an NPI, it already belongs to the nonprofit institution serving households. And we will try to look at the criteria in the following slides. So an NPI, as I have mentioned earlier, can be a market producer. And when we say that a unit or an entity is a market producer, that unit will sell their output at prices that are economically significant. And when we say economically significant, they base their prices or charge their fees or based on the production cost, and the cost or the prices that they charge are sufficiently high to have a significant influence on the demand for their service. And NPIs that are considered as market producers are considered part of the corporation sector. So if you have recalled in the previous slide, we have two types of corporations, non-financial and financial. And depending on the type of activity, whether the NPI is engaged in financial services or not, that would determine whether the NPI falls under the non-financial corporations or financial corporations. But the bottom line here is that when the NPI is engaged in market production, then it belongs to the corporation sector. Take note too that uh, those NPIs whose activities are restricted to serving a subset of other market producers are also considered corporations. So included here are the Chamber of Commerce, Agriculture, Manufacturing, or trade associations, employers organizations, and certain research or testing laboratories. Take note that although such NPIs are usually financed by contributions or subscriptions from the group of enterprises concerned, the subscriptions are treated not as transfers but payments for the services rendered. And as such, these NPIs are considered market producers and therefore corporations. So are we clear so far? I'll assume that we're clear. So I'll proceed. NPIs can also be non-market producers. And when NPIs are non-market producers, the issue of control comes in. So basically, when you're a non-market producer, you can be controlled by the government or by the household. So what do we mean first by non-market producers? When we say non-market producers, these are entities or units that provide their output for free or at prices that are not economically significant. So if NPI satisfies the following condition, then it is a non-market producer. SNA also defines control as the ability to influence the general policy or direction of the NPI. And the SNA lays out um, different categories uh, on control. And this slide shows you the criteria um, pointing out when the NPI is government controlled. So an NPI is controlled by the government if the following five indicators uh, are met or if any of the five indicators are met. Number one, the first criteria, um, it's about the appointment of if the government influences the appointment of officers. Number two, if the government influences other provisions of enabling instruments. Third one, related to contractual agreements. Fourth one, if the government, the degree of financing of the NPI, if it's mainly funded by the government. The fifth one, about risk exposure. So if the government carries significant risk exposure associated to the NPI, then these are the following criteria that we can use so that we can say that the NPI is controlled by the government. And if any of these criteria are satisfied, then we say that the NPI is a non-market producer and is controlled by the government. Therefore, it is part of the general government sector. So again, if the NPI is a non-market producer and controlled by the government, it's part of the general government sector. Now, all the NPIs that are not considered as part of corporations, so basically non-market producer, and not part of the general government, so they are not controlled by the government, are considered part of the non-profit institutions serving household sector. So that's why I have mentioned earlier that all NPSHs are NPIs, but not all NPIs are NPSHs. So according to ESA 2010, these are some examples of NPSHs. So we have associations of persons created to provide goods or services primarily for the benefit of the members themselves, charities, reliefs, or aid agencies for philanthropic purposes, and institutions providing collective services for free. Take note too that the NPISH sector includes charities, relief, or aid agencies serving non-resident units and excludes entities where membership gives right to predetermined set of goods and services. Okay. So again, to recap everything we have discussed, an entity or an institutional unit is a part of the NPISH sector if it is a non-market producer and it is not controlled by the government. Okay. And perhaps a decision tree might help us in deciding whether the unit belongs to the NPISH sector. So the first question that we're going to ask is whether the unit is a resident. If the answer is no, then it's part of the rest of the world. But if the answer is yes, we ask another question. Is it a household or an institutional household? So basically, if the answer is yes, straightforward, it is part of the household sector. And if the answer is no, we ask if the uh, legal or social entity is a non-market producer. So basically there are two answers for this question. So suppose the answer is no. The next question that we're going to ask is, does the unit produce financial services? So if it does, then it's part of the financial corporation sector. And if it does not produce financial services, then it's part of the non-financial corporations. So now, suppose it's a non-market producer. The next question that we should ask is whether the unit is controlled by the government. If the answer is yes, then it belongs to the general government sector. And if the answer is no, then we consider it as part of the NPISH sector. So this is a decision tree that can help us in sectorizing units into various institutional sectors. Okay. So basically, that's for the introductory part of an NPISH. And we are really interested, given that we now know what NPISHs are, we can now proceed to the final consumption expenditure of NPISHs. So the final consumption expenditure of NPISHs, um, we can estimate it using a sum of cost approach adjusted for incidental sales, own account capital formation, and goods and services purchased from market producers. So for many NPShes, the value of its FCE is just equal to its non-market output. And later on in our worksheet example, we will see the case when the NPS produces solely non-market output, and when it produces market output too. We'll see that later. Okay, so given this formula, let's try to apply this bullet points in the next slide. So suppose we have a local food bank in a country, let's call it country Y, and it engages in the following transaction. So number one, it received and distributed 30,000 worth of in-kind donations from public in the current year. It also paid staff 50,000 in compensation annually, and it paid 70,000 in rent, utilities, office supplies, and communications for the year. And finally, it owned a delivery truck. And the estimated cost of depreciation of the truck is 600 per year. So the question here is, how much is the FCE of this food pack? So uh, can you type in your answers or your guesses in the chat box so that we can try to uh, so we can foster engagement. Okay, so let me just check my chat box. So anyone from the group, what's the answer? Do you have any guess on how much is the FCE of this uh, local food bank, which is which we consider as NPISH? Okay, so according to Jam, it's 100,000. Okay, thank you, Jam, for participating. The answer is 1,000. Uh, is 120,600. So basically, um, if you can recall, the NPISH FCE is just equal to the gross output of the producer of the NPISH less sales plus social transfers in kind. So in here, there are no social transfers in kind, only output. And the output of the NPISH is composed of the compensation it pays its workers, so 50,000. And it also includes the intermediate costs used to produce the output, so 70,000. And finally, the CFC, represented by the depreciation 600. So that's why it's 50,000 plus 70,000 plus 600 equals 120,600. So take note that we do not include the 30,000 here because in-kind food donations are not considered a final consumption expenditure of the food bank, but rather these are classified as current transfers received from the households upon the receipt of the food bank and the current transfers paid to households upon distribution. And perhaps for everyone to be more familiar with the formula on how to compute for NPISH FCE, we can use this general estimation procedure. So we start with the output of the NPISH. So output of the NPISH is just the sum of the intermediate costs in IC plus the factor payments. So compensation of employees, then we also add consumption of fixed capital and then other taxes. If there's subsidies, we subtract it and own account GFCF. And once we get an estimate of the output of the NPISH, we can now proceed in calculating the FCE of the institutional sector, which is basically the output of the NPISH adjusted for the value of market sales of that unit plus the social transfers in kind it gives to households. So here is our general estimation procedure. Again, the estimation procedure for NPISH FCE follows the cost sum of cost approach like the method used in calculating for GFCE. We also use that in the calculation of NPISH FCE. Okay. Aside from that, we can also classify final consumption expenditure of NPISH. And generally, like GFCE, NPISH FCE is classified two ways. One is by economic classification. So in here, we classify it whether it's COE, it's purchases of goods and services, or whether it's consumption of fixed capital. We can also classify NPISH FCE according to purpose or by functional classification. And we use the classification of the purposes of nonprofit institutions serving households or COPNI for this. And there in the COPNI, there are many categories. So COPNI is like the COICOP of NPISH, of nonprofit institutions. So there are also categories. We have housing, health, recreation, among others. And then each expenditure can be further broken down into collective or individual categories. Okay, so now that we know the estimation procedure and the classification of NPISH FCE, let's now go to the data sources and requirements. Basically, there are three data sources that we can use in estimating NPISH FCE. Number one is the survey. Survey, meaning some countries would use this uh, uh, some countries would use this to collect information related to the revenues and expenses expenses which can then be used to estimate NPISH FCE. We can also use taxation data, which is most available uh, for which is available for most countries. Basically, many countries would require nonprofit institutions to register with government and then submit annual statements of revenue and expenses. And those data sources can be used in the estimation of NPISH FCE. Finally, we can also use data from charitable donations. So households often report charitable donations on personal tax forms, and then these information can be used to model the share of NPISH FCE uh, in the consumption of the households. We can also use annual financial statements of NPISHs when calculating NPISH FCE. And we will do that in our worksheet example later on. Although we have these sources, each of the source would have their different strengths and challenges. So for example, for surveys, um, one strong point for using this data source is that it includes significant detail beyond revenue and expenses, and therefore can be used to develop indicators for volunteer services. But the challenge is that it is conducted periodically and it is costly to conduct surveys. For taxation data, again, it's available for most institutions, but a main challenge is that often small institutions are exempt from reporting. So institutions that are required to report generate only annual figures. Finally, for charitable donations, they might be highly accurate and consistent, but they only cover a sample of NPShes, and there are assumptions that we need to make between the share of charitable donations that represent final consumption expenditure. Okay. Uh, uh, NPISH is all because of data limitations too. NPISH FCE is typically lumped with household final consumption expenditure. As a statistic, so there are 19 ADB DMC, so band to HKG in our MRIO, and if you check, only 8 of them would report a figure for F2 or for NPISH FCE. I think there are countries where they don't really report NPISH FCE, but they just combine it with HFCE, and they publish figures for the personal consumption expenditure. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the Philippines publishes personal consumption expenditure, and that estimate includes NPISH FCE. Saudi Arabia too publishes uh, personal consumption expenditure. Although if you look at their sequence of accounts, you can find NPISH FCE there. But for their annual national accounts, they lump NPISH FCE with HFCE together. Okay. So that's for the data requirements. And now let's proceed to NPISH FCE in the SUT framework. Basically, NPISH FCE is reflected in the final use quadrant of the use table. So we have a vector for NPISH FCE. But in the use table, um, NPISH FCE must be classified by product, so by CPA or by CPC. And if it is not classified by CPA and CPC, and let's say it's classified by COPNI, then there is a need to reclassify expenditures by CPC. Though typically when NPISH is very small in a country, economies would unambiguously allocate the FCE to one of the purposes listed in the COPNI. So I think that's the end of the conceptual part of our discussion. So here are the references that I have used. 1 and 2, uh, SNA 2008 and ESA 2010. Main references, this Understanding National Accounts by the OECD, good introductory reading on national accounts. And I also use the handbook published by the UN on nonprofit and related institutions and volunteer work. There is a section on NPISH here, but if you're more interested in the social economy, you can read this handbook. This is a good reference. So that's all for the conceptual parts of my presentation. Before we proceed to the worksheet example, are there any questions? So if there are no questions, let me just show my worksheet. Can you see my worksheet?
Yes, Michael.
Thank you. So we will do a computation of NPISH FCE using financial statements. So the first example that I will show you would be for a political party. So this is a financial statement of a political party in South Africa. In South Africa, yes. So as you can see, uh, uh, items are listed here. So basically, I just copied the entire income statement of that political party. And the first thing that we need to do is to translate the items in the financial statements into S&A transactions. That is, we must identify, examine line by line whether the transactions in the financial statements are relevant in national accounts. So we've in national accounts. Okay. So in here, let's start with income. So in this political party receives allowance from Independent Electoral Commission and interest. So in the SNA, we can classify them as the first one would be current transfer received, and the other one would be interest received. So basically property income. So we also note that hire of venues, the expenses of this political party on venues, rent and electricity, promotions and publications, we can translate them into SNA transaction items. So if we translate them, if we translate venues and rent and electricity, we consider them as IC, intermediate consumption. Newspapers and promotional items, we consider them as also intermediate consumption. Salaries, this falls under compensation of employees. Travel, we assume that everything here is intermediate consumption. Auditors' fees, assuming that they have outsourced the auditing of their financial statement, then we classify them under intermediate consumption, bank charges, intermediate consumption, communication, intermediate consumption. Basically, the thing that we need to do is to classify everything into SNA transactions. So, yep. Okay. Assuming that we have classified everything as SNA transactions, we can now summarize so that we can get a measure for our total output and at the same time get a measure of our of our final consumption expenditure. So if you add up all of the intermediate consumption in this based on this financial statement, then we will get a value given by this cell. We will convert it first in 1,000 local currency units so that it will be easy for us later on when we put everything in the supply and use table. Okay. If we also collate the COE in this financial statement, the consumption of fixed capital in this financial statements were this much. And take note, the sum of IC, compensation of employees, and consumption of fixed capital will give us total output. So summing everything, we will have 29 million LCU. Okay. As you can see too here, the income of this political party is only the current transfer received and property income. So we know that market output here is zero. It does not give any transfers, social transfers in kind to households too. So the value here is zero. So in this example, the total output, which is basically your non-market output, is your final consumption expenditure. Okay. Did everyone follow? Is the example clear? Can you give me a thumbs up if it's clear? Thanks, Jack. Okay, so basically, we now have an estimate of the final consumption expenditure. But in order for us to input everything into the supply and use table framework, we need to have a product breakdown of the intermediate consumption. So how do we obtain a product breakdown of the intermediate consumption? Well, you have to classify the product categorization of those transactions labeled as IC in the financial statement. So if we do that here, we will get the following. So for example, we assume that rent and electricity The categorization would be other services. For printing and stationery, we assume that they fall under manufacturing products. And it would be helpful for us before we input everything in the supply table to supply and use table to have it summarized first. So if we summarize, have the following figures. Okay, so given this information, we have NPISH FCE, the breakdown of intermediate consumption, and take note, there is no market output here. We are now ready to plug in our values into the supply and use table framework. So in here, we have the supply table, and at the lower part, we have the use table. So perhaps before we start, and it's good to recall that an important tenet of the supply and use table would be number one, total supply must be equal to total use. And the other one would be the total output reported in the supply table must be equal to the total inputs uh, reported in the use table. Okay? And since this is for a political party, we are first interested in filling out the column for the political party. And since a political party is an example of NPISH, we will also be interested in looking uh, in the in examining the vector for NPISH FC. Okay? Okay. Let's start with filling out the supply table first. We fill out the domestic production matrix of the supply table first. So we know that the total output of this political party is worth 29 million LCU. And we are assuming that all the output produced by the political party is considered a product of the political party. Therefore, this 29.8 million must be reflected here. Okay. So as you can see, if we have after keying in the output, we have a discrepancy in the total output and the total input because we haven't reflected yet the factor inputs used by the political party as well as the intermediate inputs used. So now let's go and input everything in the use table. Let's now move on to the use table. And the first thing that we're gonna fill out would be the IC matrix of the use table. So this part. Okay, we know that the intermediate consumption used by this political party is divided between manufacturing products and other services. So the 174,000 here will be reflected in this cell. And the other services reflected in this cell. Okay. So after, take note, we still have a discrepancy of 25.6 million. This is because we haven't reflected the factor inputs yet. And we put the factor inputs in the GVA, the corresponding GVA cell. So in here, the factor inputs would be the sum of COE and consumption of fixed capital. So if we input that in, we're now sure that at least for the political party, the total output is equal to the total input. Are we clear so far? Can I get a haha reaction if it's clear? Okay. Thanks, everyone. Now, the next thing that we need to do is to resolve the discrepancies, the row discrepancies. So in order to resolve the row discrepancies, we need to allocate this 29.8 million LCU here in the use table, And we know that since according to our initial estimate, this 29.8 million are all non-market output. It will be reflected here in the vector for NPISH FCE. Okay, so if we reflect that, no, we now resolve the discrepancy at least for the row of the products of political parties. And the NPISH FCE reported in the supply and use table is equal to the NPISH FCE reported in our initial estimates. So you might ask now, we still have discrepancies, 174 and 4 million LCU. So we can reflect that in the supply table because the political we have that discrepancy because the political party used 174,000 worth of manufacturing products and it used for 4 million worth of other services products. And since the political party used it, it must have purchased it from somewhere. So assuming that the political party purchased all of the manufacturing products from abroad, then the 174 will be reflected in imports. So we resolve the discrepancy. And further, assuming that the 4 million other services products used by the political party is produced by, let's say, the other services sector of the domestic economy, that must be reflected in this cell. Okay. And given that we now have a balance, at least for the political party, we now have a balanced supply and use table. So that's how you do it. Are we clear so far? Can I get uh, a thumbs up? Okay. So it's exciting, right? But this is basic in a sense that the political party do not produce any market output. So what if uh, the NPISH or the unit produces a market output? So that would be the case for the American Red Cross. So basically, this is a worksheet of is the financial statement of the American Red Cross for the year 2020, and same steps as before. We need to classify each entry in the financial statement into S&A transactions. So in the interest of time, I'll just show it here. But let's try to review it. In here, in the income side of the financial statement, you can see that aside from the contributions, which are classified as current transfers received, they also get revenues from products and services. Basically, they sell their output. Hence, we classify it as market output. Okay, so they sell biomedical services classified as market output and program materials classified as market output. Also, an interesting thing about the financial statement of the American Red Cross is in the expenses side, there is an item for material assistance. This material assistance can be classified as social transfers in kind. So unlike our previous example in the American Red Cross, we now have market output and social transfers in kind. Okay, so same steps as before. We just summarized everything. So the value of IC is given by this figure. COE, compensation of employees, given by is worth 1.3 million. Consumption of fixed capital, about 85,000. So the sum of IC, COE, and CFC would give us total market output. Okay. So the market output basically is the sum of the revenue of the American Red Cross uh, from selling biomedical services as well as program materials. So basically, that's worth uh, 1.8 million. And we also have social transfers in kind worth 136,000 local currency units. So to compute for the NPISH FCE, what we do is we subtract the market output from the market output to the total output and then add the social transfers in kind. So if we do that, we now have a value of we now have a value for the NPISH 774782. It will be also useful for us later on to have to compute for non-market output. But basically, the non-market output is just the difference between the total output and the market output. Okay, so if we do that, we have this amount 637,996. Okay. So now that we are interested in putting the figures in our supply and use table, we will follow the same steps. We still need the breakdown of intermediate consumption, but now we also need to have the breakdown of market output. Okay. So if we compile everything, we have the following figures. Okay, so given that we are given the computations that we have made, we are now ready to check or input everything in our SUP framework. Okay, we will follow the same logic as before. We will start with the domestic production matrix of the supply table. So in here, let's start with the market output. So this, the American Red Cross, we considered it as part of the health and fish industry. So it produces 1.7 million worth of biomedical services. We assume that biomedical services are uh, falls under this product, health and fish. So we put everything here. It also produces program materials. So the program materials assume that they are all manufacturing products. So we put the 108 here. Okay. And now, as you can see, we still have, we only reflected the market output. We must reflect to non-market output. Take note that in the domestic production matrix in the supply table, it must also reflect the non-market output, not only the market output. So assuming that this is the value that we have computed for non-market output, we add it here in the diagonal entry. So as a check, you can see that the total output reported in the supply table is now equal to the total output in our initial computations. But there is still discrepancy because we haven't filled out yet the use table. And let us now try to fill out the use table. So it used other services products. So the 787,000 will be reflected here. And then for manufacturing products, it will be reflected here. And the factor inputs in the GVA cell, so COE plus CFC. So we don't have any discrepancies anymore, at least column-wise. So total output is equal to total input. But we have discrepancies row-wise. So we first try to resolve the discrepancy in the health and fish row. So we know that this NPISH earns revenues from market production, so biomedical services. And in here, it must, since it produced 1.7 million worth of biomedical services, there must be a sector or an industry or a final user that used it. So assume that it was used by the household. So, okay, we still have 637,996. That must also be reflected discrepancy. And this 637,996 is equal to the non-market output. And the non-market output of the NPISH must be reflected in the NPISH FC here. So by doing that, we now resolve the discrepancy in this row. But the problem here is that and that we have our calculation is equal to 77478 SUT, it's still 637,996. And the reason for this is because we haven't reflected yet the social transfers in kind. So again, the social we need to go back to our mapping earlier. Take note that the social transfers in kind would be material assistance. And since material assistance is quite uh, vague, we need to make an assumption. And assuming that the material assistance provided by the NPISH is in the form of manufacturing products, so the social transfers in kind must be reflected here. And if we reflect that, we are now sure that the NPISH FCE is in our calculations is equal to the NPISH FCE uh, in the use table. Okay, are we clear with that? Can I get a haha react? Okay, thank you everyone. But basically that's how you do it. The remaining discrepancies, since there are users that have used manufacturing products, it must be produced by uh, uh, the domestic sector or by the rest of the world. So it will be reflected here in imports, and we will assuming that uh, the discrepancies. So let's try to resolve the discrepancies. So let's assume that the remaining 274,000 is sourced from the rest of the world. So it will be reflected here. And as let's further assume that the 787,000 used by the health NPISH is sourced from the health sector, and it will be reflected here. So basically, that's it. That's how you. Oh, sorry. That's how you reflect everything in the supply and use table. And with that, my presentation is already finished. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise them now. Perhaps there are no questions. So over to you, Cheska. Thanks, everyone.